Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Jennifer Mack. Dr. Mack is an assistant professor in the Department of Speech, Language, and Hearing Sciences, as well as in the Neuroscience and Behavior graduate program at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She brings a unique and powerful perspective to her work, bridging linguistics, neuroscience, and clinical practice. Her academic journey began with a BA in linguistics from Rice University, followed by an MA and PhD in linguistics at Yale University. She then completed 2 postdoctoral fellowships, one in psychology and linguistics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and another in communication sciences and disorders at Northwestern University. Dr. Mack's research interests center on post-stroke aphasia, primary progressive aphasia, language processing, the neural organization of language, and interventions for communication partners. Her work is deeply grounded in understanding not only how language breaks down, but also how we can better support people living with aphasia by empowering their communication partners. So today, Dr. Mack will share an exciting new line of research investigating how communication partners process and understand language produced by people with aphasia using insights from language processing models. And this work opens up exciting new avenues for improving everyday communication and enriching the lives of people with aphasia and those around them. So please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Jennifer Mack.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for the nice day here. It's been nice to hear about everyone's research, and I'm really happy to get to present some of my work with you all. So I'm Jennifer. I direct the Inclusive Research on Language Processes, or IRL lab at UMass Amherst, and a few of us are here virtually, so nice to see you all as well from my lab. Start with just a few disclosures. So I'm a full-time employee at UMass Amherst and currently have research funding from the NIH. I'm on the JSLHR editorial board and am a member of ASHA and the Academy of Aphasia. So I'll start by introducing a well-known problem and then present an opportunity to address it. So the problem is that, well-known problem is that people with aphasia, or PWA, often have difficulty conveying their thoughts to communication partners. And many people with aphasia report that these challenges are greater when they're interacting with unfamiliar communication partners who don't know them and who may know nothing about aphasia. These experiences can contribute to social isolation for people with aphasia. For example, one person with aphasia was quoted as saying, "My world becomes smaller every time they miscommunicate with someone unfamiliar." So the way that I frame this problem at the beginning of the slide, so people with aphasia often have difficulty conveying their thoughts, is the most common formulation of the problem. An alternative and complementary way to frame the same problem is that unfamiliar communication partners have difficulty receiving messages from people with aphasia. And this is, of course, in large part because language features that are common in aphasia cause comprehension challenges for communication partners. This is true for many different language features that we see in aphasia. So Casilio et al. Identified 4 dimensions of naturalistic spoken language production in aphasia: paraphasia, which is misselection of words and sounds; logopenia, paucity of words; agrammatism, or grammatical omissions; and motor speech, praxia and or dysarthria. And found that all 4 of these were associated with difficulty getting the message or understanding the words of a person with aphasia. Non-fluent language production, such as pauses and other disfluencies, also contribute to comprehension difficulty for communication partners. So this problem presents an opportunity, which is to enhance unfamiliar communication partners' ability to overcome the challenges that are posed by these language features in aphasia. This opportunity, I think, is underexplored. There are few, possibly no, interventions that are focused on improving unfamiliar communication partners' ability to understand people with aphasia. And while there is a large body of literature on communication partner training for unfamiliar people, they haven't included comprehension as an outcome measure. As far as I know, always happy to learn about cases where someone has done this. At the same time, this is a promising direction for research. It's been shown that you can improve people's ability to comprehend speakers who have speech and language conditions. This has been shown through the development of effective interventions for comprehension of speakers with dysarthria. There are probably many ways to approach this. In our lab, we're pursuing this opportunity using a language processing approach in which we investigate the processes that take place as unfamiliar communication partners attempt to understand people with aphasia. So one of the goals of this work is to identify key language processes that contribute to either successfully understanding a person with aphasia, or when these processes don't happen, contribute to failing to understand a person with aphasia. And trying to find those points that can really kind of determine how it turns out. And then to enhance these processes through interventions. And our assumption is that if we facilitate language processing and communication partners, this will in turn improve their ability to understand the messages of people with aphasia. The potential impacts of this work are first and most importantly to improve communication experiences for people with aphasia, and secondarily to develop more inclusive models of language processing that include diverse speakers and listeners, such as speakers with aphasia and a range of communication partners, and that are based on real life communication challenges like what people with aphasia experience when they're trying to communicate with unfamiliar people. So in this presentation, I'm going to start by introducing the model of language processing in aphasia in communication partners that we're developing, which is called the Attitude Processing Comprehension Model. And then I'll be telling you about two studies, which will remain mysterious for the moment. But the first is one that is complete, and the second is one that's in development. We're about to begin data collection. It's the first time I've really talked about it in public, so it'll be fun to talk about it. And finally, I'll briefly discuss some future directions for this work. Okay, so this is the model that our lab has developed based on other psycholinguistic research and that we're kind of using to guide our research. We call it the Attitude Processing Comprehension, or APC model. And the basic idea is that a person's attitudes towards a speaker with aphasia, and we'll be talking about attitudes in a moment, affect their processing of the person with aphasia's language. And this in turn affects their comprehension of the person with aphasia. So to explain this model, I'll start by discussing attitudes. So what are attitudes? Attitudes in general are a way of thinking or feeling about something. They generally can be described as positive or negative or somewhere in between, but they have a valence. Attitudes are often thought to have three components: a person's knowledge or beliefs, their emotions, and their behaviors. So to illustrate this in the context of unfamiliar communication partners, you can think about the last unfamiliar person that you had a face-to-face conversation with. Your knowledge or beliefs are about that communication partner, or what you know about them, or what you believe to be true about them. Your emotions, of course, are what you felt as you were communicating with the person. And your behaviors were how you acted in the interaction, and particularly the valency of that, whether you kind of showed positive or negative communicative behaviors. Unfortunately, although not always, unfamiliar communication partners often form negative attitudes towards people with aphasia that affect all three of these components. In the area of knowledge and beliefs, many people who don't know someone with aphasia have a lack of knowledge about aphasia. Less than half of adults in the US have ever heard of aphasia. And this may lead to incorrect and harmful beliefs, such as the person with aphasia they're speaking with is not intelligent or competent. Many people experience negative emotions when communicating with people with aphasia. These include impatience, discomfort, irritation, and anxiety that they won't be able to successfully communicate with the person. Unfamiliar communication partners also show negative attitudes in some circumstances, such as listening inattentively, acting patronizing, or ignoring the person with aphasia. And of course, these attitudes then are reflected back onto the person with aphasia, and they have both short-term and long-term impacts. On the short term, when a communication partner is displaying a negative attitude, this can negatively affect the person with aphasia's communication. It can give them a negative emotional response. They feel stressed or worried. And in the long term, these attitudes may affect people with aphasia's motivation to communicate with unfamiliar people. It can lead to social isolation and negative effects on independence and well-being. So shifting the attitudes of unfamiliar people is important. The model that we're testing, the attitude processing comprehension model, provides an additional reason to shift attitudes because we believe that they may affect the communication partner's ability to understand the person with aphasia. So what attitudes are relevant? A few that we think are relevant are the communication partner's beliefs about the speaker's intelligence and language skills. We're talking about this more later. The communication partner's patience, and the communication partner's behavior, particularly in the form of attentive listening. I'll be talking kind of specifically about that later on. Our approach in testing this model is through interventions. We attempt to identify interactions that will improve communication partners' attitudes and therefore their processing and comprehension. Our research to date has focused on using self-advocacy statements to do so. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about now. Okay, so self-advocacy statements are a way of communicating your needs to other people. For people with aphasia, these needs often relate to communication. So this slide shows a self-advocacy script or a spoken self-advocacy statement that a person with aphasia might produce. It has typical content for this type of statement, including self-disclosure of aphasia. So I have aphasia, information about aphasia. This means I have difficulty with language. Aphasia affects my language, not my intelligence. And simple communication strategies like please speak directly to me and give me time to communicate. This comes from a script training study from Fredrickson and colleagues, the specific script. So producing spoken self-advocacy statements can be challenging for people with aphasia. Some people with aphasia find even the word aphasia hard to produce, and many find the concept hard to explain. Everyone finds it hard to explain. So many people with aphasia can benefit from support for their self-advocacy, and this can come in multiple forms, including an advocacy script, which is on the left here. So a spoken script that a person with aphasia might develop on their own or collaboratively with an SLP and then practice until they're able to produce it effectively. Self-advocacy is a common topic that's chosen by people with aphasia when they're in script training and have the ability to develop their own script. So this is a need. A different form of communicative support is the aphasia ID card, which is on the right, which a person with aphasia can customize, print out, and then hand to a communication partner. And there are many templates available online, and this is just from one of them. Okay, so people with aphasia have reported that self-advocacy statements shift the attitudes of unfamiliar communication partners. We have a quote from a person with aphasia on the left who said, "I say it, I've had a stroke, and it's amazing how it changes people to me. Then they have more patience." On the right, a quote from a friend of a person with aphasia. "When waitresses in busy restaurants come over, they're obviously rushed. Trish will say, 'I have a speech problem.' You can feel them calm down, recognizing they're just not going to be able to rush this customer." People with aphasia have also reported that using a self-advocacy statement has helped them in everyday tasks like getting their car fixed and in emergencies, like interacting with law enforcement. And these negative effects are not unique to aphasia. I wanted to mention here that there is a huge literature specifically on stuttering that focuses on the effects of self-advocacy and self-disclosure. And I think in aphasia, we're starting to kind of catch up to that. Okay, so however, there are research gaps. So we know that self-advocacy is effective for many people with aphasia, but this is mostly through the reports of individual people with aphasia. We don't really know about the size and the consistency of these effects of self-advocacy on attitudes across speakers with aphasia and across communication partners. Because what people with aphasia see are the behaviors of communication partners and not what underlies them. We don't really know the effects of self-advocacy on communication partners' knowledge, beliefs, and emotions, kind of the internal aspects of attitudes. And finally, and of a special interest to our lab, are the effects of self-advocacy statements on communication partners, language processing, and comprehension. And these research gaps have led our lab to take an experimental approach to looking at self-advocacy, using both survey experiments to look at language attitudes and language processing experiments, specifically eye tracking, to look at language processing and comprehension. Okay, so this brings us to the no longer mysterious study 1, but it needed some context for the title to make sense, which is looking at the effects of aphasia self-advocacy scripts on unfamiliar listeners' knowledge, beliefs, and emotions. The study was recently published earlier this year. So our research questions in this study were, how does listening to a self-advocacy script produced by a person with aphasia affect unfamiliar listeners with respect to their knowledge about the person's aphasia, their beliefs about the person's intelligence and personality, the emotions they experience while listening to the speaker, and their comprehension challenges, because we are heading towards looking more at processing and comprehension. Well, this is not a processing study. So this study was a survey experiment where we recruited participants on the web platform Prolific and ran the experiment on Qualtrics. We had 238 participants who were between the ages of 40 and 59, lived in the US, had at least a high school education, and reported that they were fluent in English with typical language and hearing. These participants were randomly assigned to one of 4 groups, and each group heard exactly one script, a script that was either produced of one of 2 speakers with aphasia, and script that either was an advocacy script or a neutral script. We called it a control script. So the speakers in this study, I wanted to mention that the data here comes from the Fredrickson script corpus and aphasia bank, as do the scripts. So both speakers were middle-aged adults who had Broca's aphasia and apraxia of speech. Speaker 1 was a white man who had severe aphasia and moderate apraxia of speech, whereas speaker 2 was a Black woman with moderate aphasia and severe apraxia of speech. They both had similar WOB, they had the same WOB fluency score of 4, indicating halting telegraphic speech. So we obtained scripts produced by these speakers from the Fredrickson script corpus in Aphasia Bank, which were collected as part of a script training study. Here is the text of the scripts. The advocacy script is the same one that we saw earlier in the talk. And the control script is meant to be a content neutral script about the weather in the southern United States, which is matched in linguistic properties to the advocacy script. In our survey experiments, we used audio-only versions of these scripts to protect the privacy of the research participants who had recorded them. And we used scripts that were produced using unison production, which is a script training technique in which the person with aphasia, apraxia, produces the script in time with a model speaker while viewing the speaker's mouth and listening to the speaker over headphones. And the reason we used these particular scripts is that they allowed the speakers to convey most of the content of the script effectively, but they did still make errors of both speech and language. So even with the support of the unison production. So participants in our study listened to one of these scripts and then they answered an open-ended question. What thoughts or emotions did you experience while listening to the speaker? Please write 1 to 3 comments, which they did. We analyzed their comments first using a codebook analysis. This was a little foray into qualitative data analysis for me, which then I ended up counting the results, which shows you that I'm really a quantitative researcher. But so we were trying to capture everything that was in participants' responses. So we created a codebook through an inductive and iterative process. And then the final codes were reviewed by 3 of us. We also did an emotion word analysis in which we identified all of the emotion words that people use to describe their experiences in listening to the speaker. And then 2 of us reviewed those final lists. And the outcome of these analyses were the percentage of responses that contained each code or emotion word. So we could compare experiences between the 2 lists and across the 2 speakers. After the open-ended question, participants answered 4 rating questions on a visual analog or slider scale. They read a sentence fragment, like I felt that understanding the speaker was, and then they positioned a slider icon somewhere on a line where there was a negative attribute on the left, like hard, and a positive attribute on the right, like easy. These responses are scaled from 0 to 100 in statistical analyses. There were 4 questions that probed participants' beliefs about the speaker's intelligence and personality, 2 that probed their emotions while listening, and 2 that were focused on their comprehension challenges. These data were analyzed using Bayesian linear regression analyses, where we looked at both the magnitude and the certainty of effects. And we were really interested in actually the distribution of ratings and not just kind of mean differences. But for this talk, I'm going to be presenting just the magnitude of effects that all have a high degree of certainty. Okay, so I'm going to share with you some selected results from this study that are important for informing the second study that I'm going to tell you about. So our first research question was about communication partners' knowledge of the speaker's aphasia. And we found that, as you would expect, the advocacy script increased participants' knowledge about the speaker's aphasia. We learned this through coding the statements that participants made in the open-ended question about like the speaker's condition. So a correct statement would be something like the speaker has aphasia, has a language impairment, has a speech impairment, is intelligent, had a stroke. Any of these things would be considered correct. Over half of participants made such a correct statement in the advocacy script for both speakers, whereas less than a third did for participants in the control group. No one was obligated to say anything in particular here. This is just what people chose to say in that open-ended question. We also looked at incorrect statements, particularly ones that might have indicated misperceptions about the speaker's condition, such as the speaker has an intellectual disability, speaker is deaf or hard of hearing, the speaker is intoxicated. We did get that classic one once in this study. And we found that almost a third of participants in the control condition made one of these incorrect statements, whereas this was very rare, 1 person each in the advocacy condition.
Sorry, can I make sure I understand the graph? So when you have control condition 28, it's 28 people in that.
28% of responses contained an incorrect statement about the speaker's condition.
But when they were reading that the weather is sunny segment.
That's right. So they read they listened to the script about the weather being pleasant in the southern United States. And then they were asked, what thoughts or emotions were you experiencing while listening to the speaker? And about a third of them said something like, I think the speaker must have been deaf. Right. So they said something incorrect.
Correct. Okay,
Yeah.
got it. Thanks.
A variety of incorrect things, but something incorrect about the speaker's condition.
Got it. Okay.
We had a surprising finding, which is that the advocacy script seemed to increase participants' retrieval of their previous knowledge of aphasia that they may have had prior to the experiment. So at the end of the survey, after participants had done all the rating questions, we told them all, the speaker you just listened to had aphasia, a language disability. This was the first time we used the word aphasia in the study, so the control group had not heard it before that. Prior to this experiment, had you ever heard of aphasia? And what we found was that more participants said that they had previously heard of aphasia in the advocacy group than in the control group. This was a 14% increase for both speakers, and it was statistically significant. So it was a surprise. So who knows, but it seems possible that hearing the advocacy script may have encouraged people to remember that they actually had previously heard about aphasia, more so than in the control group when they didn't get this information. And so that's a kind of an interesting and I think not really recognized benefit of these self-advocacy statements. Our second research question was about the participants' beliefs about the speaker and specifically about the speaker's intelligence. So this is rating scale data. Participants rated how intelligent they felt that the speaker was on a scale from unintelligent, 0, to intelligent, 100. We have violin plots for each speaker and each script. There is a strong rightward shift from the control script to the advocacy script for both speakers, a 42-point increase for speaker 1 and a 20-point increase for speaker 2. The distribution of results is also interesting here in that in the control scripts, the results really cluster around the middle, around neutral. So people were either uncertain or kind of unwilling to make a judgment about the person's intelligence based on the control script, whereas for the advocacy script, they were much more likely to say that the speaker is intelligent. And of course, they were told directly, aphasia affects my language, not my intelligence, but it may also be that the act of self-advocating kind of improves people's perceptions of the speaker's intelligence. So our third research question was about emotions. This shows the results for patience. So self-advocacy scripts increased listeners' reported patience. This is on a scale from impatient to patient. For speaker 1, there was a very large 49-point increase in ratings, almost a total reversal of the pattern of results. And for speaker 2, a smaller but still substantial 22-point increase in ratings with respect to patience. And this is critical because providing sufficient time to communicate is one of the most powerful communication supports for people with aphasia. So when we looked at our emotion word analysis, we looked at the most frequent words that participants use to describe their emotional experience in each script. And just to illustrate it, I put in here a word cloud of the emotion word stems that appeared in the advocacy condition. These are stems, so it groups like empathy and empathetic together into a single stem. The 6 most common words in here all indicate sympathy, empathy, or compassion. So those words directly, and also sorry, bad, and sad, which were all used to say they felt sorry for or bad for the speaker, which are expressions of sympathy. Counting up these responses, we saw that over half of participants in the advocacy script produced at least one of these words indicating sympathy or empathy, whereas 11% did for both speakers in the control condition. The word cloud looks very different in the control condition. Here we see words pop out that indicate that they were experiencing irritation with the speaker or with the task we had given them. So the top, we do see some compassion and things in there, but the top 4 words in the control condition are frustrate, bore, annoy, and impatient. And this, by the way, is a 1-minute script. Like they did not have to wait that long, but it was bothering them, some of them. These are the counts of emotion words that indicate irritation. So frustrate, bore, annoy, and impatient. And we can see again that they're used more commonly in the control script than in the advocacy script. And that is especially the case for speaker 1. Okay, so our 4th research question had to do with comprehension challenges. So we wanted to get a sense of whether the advocacy script shifted listeners' perception of how hard it was to understand the speaker. So this is one section of the results where we saw qualitatively instead of just quantitatively different patterns of results for the 2 speakers. So this is the ratings of the listener's ease of understanding for speaker 1. This improved by 23 points in the advocacy script as compared to the control script. Whereas for speaker 2, there was no reliable difference in ratings. You can see those violin plots are like completely identical between the 2 scripts. And also they found her harder to understand overall than speaker 1, and substantially so. The open-ended responses gave us a sense of what it was that people were finding difficult about them, because people told us they were not, I don't think, very shy in this study. So the main challenges for listener 1 seemed to be attending to him and focusing on his language content despite the slow rate. So it's consistently what people said. It was hard to continue to pay attention. Whereas for speaker 2, the main challenge that people had was speech intelligibility. She had more severe apraxia of speech, and they had some challenges discerning what she was saying. So what this seems to suggest to us is that the advocacy script may have helped with the challenge of paying attention, being engaged, and sticking with speaker 1 despite the slow rate. So kind of an attitude shift type of thing, but didn't seem to be effective at improving comprehension of the speaker who had intelligibility challenges. So this was interesting to us. Okay, so to conclude this study, It suggests that self-advocacy statements powerfully shift the attitudes of unfamiliar communication partners of people with aphasia. This is consistent with the reports of people with aphasia and other research. Based on both our research and other research, which is cited on the bottom, I constructed this figure of the impact of self-advocacy statements on people with aphasia. So when a person with aphasia decides to use a self-advocacy statement, so number 1 on the figure, it is likely to improve the attitudes of the unfamiliar communication partner, including their knowledge of aphasia, their emotions, specifically their patience and empathy, and reducing their irritation. And it's likely to result in positive behaviors, including greater attention and greater respect. This supportive behavior then gets mirrored back to the person with aphasia, who's likely to have improved communication experiences, such as an increase in confidence and motivation. This is from other work, not from our labs, and a reduction in stress. So I wanted to acknowledge some of the limitations of our survey experiment and how they've led to our goals for our current research and research that we'll do in the future. So the scripts that we use, I mentioned that they were produced using unison production, which was, for this study, essential in order for people to be able to convey some of the main script content effectively. This means that the number of language errors in the samples were relatively few. It's not really a natural production situation. And the script content was uniform and didn't vary across speakers. And so one of our goals is to increase the naturalistic features of the language stimuli that we use to look at the effects of self-advocacy. With respect to the speakers and the research participants, we had 2 speakers with aphasia who had relatively similar language profiles, and yet still we saw pretty different effects with respect to comprehension challenges, at least. The listeners in this study were all middle-aged adults, and we didn't have much racial or ethnic diversity in this sample. And so one of our goals is to investigate effects of self-advocacy in more diverse groups of people with aphasia and communication partners. The survey experiment was designed to measure attitudes. It didn't provide information about language processing and provided only some kind of preliminary insights about comprehension. So our goal was to investigate whether changes in attitudes facilitate language processing and comprehension, which leads us to study 2. Okay, so study 2 is our current study. It's a clinical trial examining the effects of aphasia identification cards on service workers' comprehension of people with aphasia. We are in right now the last couple weeks before we start collecting data. So we're right at that starting to recruit point, and it will be run over the next 1 to 2 years. So our name for the study is PAUSE, or Processes and Attitudes Underlying Service Encounters. This is also the name of the study that we use with research participants because we cannot disclose that it is about aphasia or ID cards without disclosing that it's a disclosure study, so we need to do that. And I wanted to acknowledge our current research team, some of whom are here at this presentation. So research assistants, Angela Merzen, Madeline Peck, Nina Blanche, and Catherine Wilker, consultant Matt Walensky, and methodologist Holly Laws. Okay, so this project focused specifically on service workers because we think it's important to attempt to improve service workers' ability to understand people with aphasia. So we define service worker very broadly as anyone who interacts with customers to provide goods, services, or information. So this includes a wide range of occupations, from bank tellers to hairstylists to sales associates. Communicating with service workers is or can be part of essential everyday activities like ordering food in a restaurant, asking a bus driver about the next stop, or asking for instructions in a pharmacy. And beyond their practical purposes, service interactions can increase a well-being and sense of connection. However, people with aphasia often struggle to convey their needs to service workers. And so improving service workers' comprehension is important for supporting people with aphasia's ability to do essential things independently, and build social connections. So we know that self-advocacy statements in general shift communication partners' attitudes. This study uses aphasia ID cards to do so because we think they're especially well suited to service interactions. In focus group studies, both people with aphasia and service workers have mentioned that they find ID cards to be helpful in service interactions. And one of the reasons is that they can be read quickly, and so therefore they fit well into a service interaction, as opposed to, for example, delivering a minute-long monologue, which might not feel particularly natural in a service interaction. So this is the aphasia ID card that we're using in our study. It's very similar to the script you saw before. There are a couple edits, but this can be read in about 10 seconds at an average adult reading rate. We've also found in some of our preliminary research that aphasia ID cards can increase unfamiliar communication partners' attention to a speaker with aphasia. So in our preliminary study, we used eye tracking to measure listeners' attention while they listened to a speaker with aphasia. Participants followed simple instructions that were produced by a speaker with non-fluent aphasia. So things like click on the apple while viewing pairs of pictures, like an apple and a banana. Participants were either assigned to a card group in which they viewed an aphasia ID card before they listened to the speaker, or a no card group in which they didn't. This is one of the, I think, main findings in the eye tracking results. What you're looking at is the time course of fixations on the target picture. So the apple, if the speaker said click on the apple, and in the card group as compared to the no card group. And what we found was that listeners in the card group had a tendency to sustain their attention on the target much longer than did listeners in the no card group. So that suggested to us that ID cards also may be helpful in shifting processes. Right, so in our current study, we'll be recruiting 160 service workers between the ages of 18 to 59 who have at least a high school diploma or equivalent, and who report that they have good comprehension of spoken and written English. We are including both monolingual and bilingual participants who report good English fluency. Participants will be recruited near our study location, which is the UMass Amherst Center in downtown Springfield. This is about 35 minutes away from Amherst. We decided to collect data there because we wanted to be a city environment, where we could go out and recruit people and have them be able to get to us easily. If you know Amherst, it's a little quiet, so this will be a good setting for us. Okay, so our general hypothesis is that aphasia ID cards are going to improve communication partners' attitudes for all the same reasons that spoken self-advocacy statements do. And this will facilitate language processing and comprehension. I'm going to be sharing the specific hypotheses about that shortly, but I will first introduce the main components of the study that will give a little more context to how we're going to be testing this hypothesis. Okay. So this is a timeline of the study from the perspective of a participant. Each participant will be in the lab for a single 2-hour-ish session where they will initially do some screenings of their hearing, vision, and cognition, and then we'll provide information about their demographics, language background, service work experience, and any history of neurological conditions. Then participants will be randomly assigned to groups. Half will be assigned to a card group and half will be assigned to a no card group. And after that, the intervention will be administered. The intervention is an introduction to a customer that they're going to be listening to throughout the rest of the experiment. And that introduction will either include an ID card or not. I'll be showing you what that looks like in a moment. Then participants will do an attitude survey to measure their attitudes towards the speaker, and that derives some of our outcome measures. And then they'll do what's called the service request comprehension task, which is a task that we've developed to measure their processing and comprehension of this customer that they're going to be listening to. After collection of the outcome measures, we'll ask participants about any prior experience they've had with aphasia, and we'll ask them questions about their perspectives on aphasia ID cards and what they find to be helpful and less helpful. And then we'll finish the study by debriefing participants and providing some education on aphasia, ID cards, and communication strategies. Okay, so I'm going to show you the intervention. It's an unusual intervention. So the intervention is an introduction to a customer. So the participants are going to be told that they will imagine themselves listening to a customer in a variety of settings. They'll first be introduced to him by video. And in the card group, only the customer will present a card to a worker. So they'll be told to pay attention to the customer who is the man in this video. It's the second customer that you're going to see. Okay, so short, simple, yeah. So he hands the card to the worker behind the counter, and in the control version of this, the video is cut before he hands the card. Then participants in the card group only, of course, will read the aphasia ID card, which will be zoomed in on. Then we'll have an initial exposure to the customer's speech and language, which we'll use to derive attitude ratings. This consists of 4 sentences. They're service requests, so things you might say in a service context, recorded by the customer. And I wanted to mention now that the person in the video is a colleague who did this for us. The person whose language we're using is a research participant with aphasia, and we're not using a video of him in order to protect his privacy. So they're not actually the same person. Okay, so moving to the outcome measures. So this is the intervention. Immediately after the intervention, participants will complete an attitude survey. This is very similar to the one you just saw, that has one open-ended question about the thoughts and emotions they listen to while while listening to the customer. And then 10 rating scale questions about their knowledge and beliefs about the customer, their emotions, and their comprehension challenges. So that's simple. The next part is less simple, which is the service request comprehension task. So this is a task that we developed to be contextualized, which means that it incorporates features of real life service interactions. And it tests service workers' processing and comprehension of the customer's service requests. So service requests are requests for goods, services, or information that a person might make to a service worker. And it measures processing and comprehension using eye tracking while listening, visual world eye tracking, in which the research participant is listening to the customer while viewing pictures that are possible interpretations of what the customer said. I'll illustrate this now with a sample trial. So each trial begins with a context that the participant is supposed to imagine. You are, for example, you are a trainer working in a gym. A gym member says, then a 4-picture array is presented with the person with aphasia's recording.
Where are the towels, please?
I'm trying to turn that down on my end, but I'm not sure if, maybe I don't know if that matters. Okay, so where are the towels, please? So the participant's task is just to click on the picture that they think matches the customer's intent. In this case, that's going to be the towels, and their fixations on the pictures indicate their language processes. So you just heard the speaker, and so I'm going to tell you a little bit more about him. So the speaker with aphasia, who plays the spoken role of the customer, is a white man in his 60s with chronic post-stroke aphasia. He has mild anomic aphasia with mild apraxia of speech. These are his scores on the quick aphasia battery. So he showed deficits in word finding, grammatical construction, and speech motor programming. We administered the aphasia communication outcome measure to get a sense of his communication experiences in everyday life. And we were really interested in his answer to the first question on the ACOM, which is how effectively do you ask for information from store employees? He answered somewhat to that. indicating that he does have some difficulty communicating with store employees in real life. So the process of making the recordings was interesting in itself, so I wanted to tell you a little bit about that, starting with our goals. So our first goal for these recordings was that they be naturalistic. We wanted them to contain the speaker with aphasia's real speech and language patterns. And we wanted them to be both syntactically and pragmatically varied, so not kind of a uniform structure. We also wanted them, and in fact needed them, to be experimentally controlled so that we're able to group trials together and analyze processes. And so in order to get experimental control, we created requests that all refer to a physical object, which is a common source of real life communication breakdowns between people with aphasia and service workers. So describing, I want a larger one, not a smaller one, for example. And we also needed to control the psycholinguistic features of the words and the pictures in the arrays. So in order to elicit the service request recordings from the speaker with aphasia, we developed prompts like this. The speaker was encouraged to envision himself in a service interaction. So kind of the reverse of what we saw before. You're at a gym, you're talking to a trainer. We gave him a message to convey. You want to know where the towels are. And these messages contained a keyword that referred to a physical object, in this case, a towel. And this is what allowed us to have experimental control over these keywords in the sentences. In order to make these recordings as naturalistic as we could, we encouraged the speaker to express the message in his own words. We said, please express this idea to the trainer. We emphasized that any way he wanted to express it was fine. And so we ended up with recordings like this that contain some natural errors, but that also are conveying the message that we want to convey. And the speaker was great at doing it. He had a mild profile and kind of nailed it, so it worked out well. Okay. So moving on to the study aims and hypotheses. So again, we hypothesized that aphasia ID cards will improve listeners' attitudes, which will in turn facilitate their language processing and comprehension. Attitudes in this study are measured using the attitude survey, and processing and comprehension is measured using the service request comprehension task. We have two specific hypotheses. The one on the left is focused on comprehension of sentences that contain long pauses, and the one on the right is focused on comprehension of sentences that contains paraphasias. And I see I know it's running a little late on time. I think I can get through this pretty quickly. So with respect to long pauses, the reason we decided to investigate long pauses is that people with aphasia produce them frequently. These pauses cause both impatience and comprehension difficulty for communication partners. And we have thought that this may relate to difficulty with linguistic integration, which is the combination of words into sentences. A participant in our previous study looking at self-advocacy scripts had a quote to this effect. He said, they said, the words seemed almost disconnected from one another, and it made my brain hurt to piece the words together into a full thought or sentence. I tell you, they weren't shy. But it's actually really useful information about processing, I thought, that came from some of these responses. So our hypothesis was that aphasia ID cards would improve communication partners' patience, which would in turn improve their linguistic integration, because if they're more patient, they're more able to hold words in memory between, like while they're during that long pause, and therefore able to combine their meanings, which would facilitate their comprehension of long sentences with long pauses. This is an example trial with long pauses on the service request comprehension task. I'll just show it to you. You are a sales assistant working at Target. A customer says,
Do you happen to have pink hair dryers?
That's loud. So there's a 5-second pause in between pink and hair dryers here. And our hypothesis was that if the ID cards improve linguistic integration, it would facilitate fixations on the pink hair dryer after the pause, indicating combination of the words pink and hair dryer. This error is actually simulated, but I think due to time, I'm not going to explain how we simulated the errors in this case. So I want to show you paraphasias quickly. So our other hypothesis relates to paraphasias, which of course are common in aphasia and contribute to difficulty comprehending speakers with aphasia. We hypothesized that unfamiliar communication partners may struggle with error repair. So when they realize that a person with aphasia has made an error, they may have difficulty repairing the speaker's error to recover what their intended meaning was. Attitudes are relevant here. It's been shown that listeners are more likely to repair a speaker's errors when they believe that the speaker has limited language skills, because then they think, that's a language error. I need to figure out what the person meant instead of kind of taking it as just an implausible statement. So our hypothesis for paraphasias was that aphasia ID cards would improve communication partners' knowledge of aphasia, specifically knowing that the speaker was intelligent and had word-finding difficulty, which would then facilitate error repair and comprehension of sentences with paraphasias. I guess I'll skip illustrating that just in the context of time.
Where are the owls?
So those are the main aims of our study and how we're testing it. To support people with aphasia in self-advocating effectively, we're also planning to investigate service workers' reading of aphasia ID cards. So we're collecting eye data while the card is read to learn about how long do they take to read it, what do they focus on, and how does this relate to effects of the ID card, to hopefully get a sense of like what's the important content in the card. We'll also be asking service workers this directly by asking them what they found helpful about the card or unhelpful, or what could be added or changed about it. And we're also hoping to have a direct impact. We're running a relatively large number of service workers in Springfield. So we're going to be providing them with information about aphasia and ID cards and communication strategies that they can use. Last slide here. So I kept future directions really brief because this entire clinical trial is a future direction. But in addition to actually running the trial, one of our goals is to continue to develop the service request comprehension task. Right now we have one speaker in the task. We want more speakers. It is very labor intensive. We learned to do that. But we're going to continue to collect data and add in speakers who vary with respect to both demographics and aphasia profile to increase the generalizability of the task. We're planning to evaluate and refine our procedures for eliciting naturalistic and experimentally controlled recordings from people with aphasia. We learned a lot from this experience. We're going to keep working on that. And also to continue to develop the attitude processing and comprehension model, focusing in particular on different language features such as agrammatism that may pose comprehension challenges. Okay, thank you very much for listening. I also wanted to thank the research participants, especially the speaker who recorded all those service requests, our collaborators, colleagues, and funding sources, both past and present. So thank you.
Wow. Standing. Jenny, I recognize some of our own survivors on this call, so I'm on the things. I'm just gonna make sure that everybody gets a chance to ask questions, but maybe people can post their questions in the chat as well. I don't know that type to get the chat. So somebody want to ask questions here? I'm on the call. Oh, I got it. It's fine.
We have someone raising.
I'm trying to see the.
Do you already have a question? Oh,
Someone raised a hand. I don't know if they want to unmute themselves and ask a question.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. My name is David. I'm a second year PhD student at the University of South Florida. So I really like your presentation, and the part that really resonates well with me was the part where you use eye tracking, and that's like a much more objective measure to actually like match their knowledge to the presentation, right before them, if I really get that right. So just a quick suggestion. So I was just wondering if in the future, like maybe in subsequent studies or something, you want to employ a much more objective measure such as pupillometry. So the idea is that you've used eye tracking, which kind of map the eye fixation. So I was just wondering if you considered like measuring the cognitive efforts recruited into the comprehension of whatever task the participants engaged in. So let's say you have two groups. So group A, they've not been exposed to the knowledge of aphasia like you presented, they have no knowledge. Then the second group, they have this exposure. Then we want to see if so the idea is that when you are very new to a task, you recruit a lot of efforts and into it, and over time when you are used to it, you put less effort. So I think that would make your study much more better. It's absolutely perfect this way, but I was just thinking if you also use that measure, it will be very nice. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. Just to clarify that you're suggesting two groups. You say that one more time what the two groups would be.
Yeah, so it's just like an observation, like okay, your participant now, let's say the social worker or something, so we can just try to see the cognitive efforts recruited into the process. So let's say we have a group that has been exposed to the knowledge of aphasia through the ID cards and some of the materials, and we have another group who is yet to be exposed, and then we present this task to them, and we want to
Okay.
see if there's a difference in the cognitive efforts recruited, right?
Thank you. Good idea.
I have so many questions, but I know we have limited time. I thought this was so fascinating and it's super impactful work. So thank you so much for your talk. I'm very interested in maybe some contrast you might expect between study 1 and study 2. When we think about things, I think it might be called the observer effect, when people behave differently when they're being watched versus how they might actually behave in other contexts. And I'm wondering if service workers specifically, because it's sort of part of their job to provide good service and, want to, or maybe they would expect to be evaluated based on their ability to do so, if perhaps they may behave differently in these tasks than someone who's just, a random unfamiliar listener. And if your
Yeah,
thoughts on that.
those are really good points. And I think both factors are there, right? So our first study was online and any profession, and this study is in person and service workers. So I think I agree with you that both of those could lead to kind of like a higher baseline motivation level, right? Like being observed and being a service worker. I know some of the observational studies looking at service interactions for people with aphasia have shown that service workers are generally pretty motivated to understand and get things right. So yeah, I think that's a really good point. And we might see the effects might be smaller than what you would see kind of in that survey study. Yeah.
Well, but to put a positive spin on that, though, it was kind of disheartening to read some of the comments you had in the
Right.
first study. And
Right.
so it's really important that we make that change.
Right.
And where to start better
Yeah.
than to this population that is motivated to provide good service. I feel like that's really why it's great that you're going after that cohort first, because you're likely to see change and hopefully
Yeah.
solid effects that you could translate to other groups of people.
Yeah.
Did you in either, well, I guess the second study hasn't happened yet, but
Yeah.
in the first study and then in the second study, do you ask folks if they know aphasia? Like if they
Yes.
know of aphasia?
Yes. At the end of the study. Yeah. So both studies are have incomplete disclosure designs where we give kind of a general, description of the purpose of the study. Like, we're interested in your ability to understand different customers, stuff like that. And then at the end, we say, okay, the study was about aphasia and ID cards. And do you know someone with aphasia? And yeah, so we follow the same questions in the NAA survey, but we do it at the end.
I was actually thinking of that, the result that you saw, that the card group had actually reported, more times I've actually heard of aphasia, because it might have been because they were given, the definition of it
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I can't feel like the amount of times I say aphasia and someone's like, oh, I think I've heard of it, but I don't really know what it is. So like, yeah. Interesting.
A quick question about that. How much time had passed between when they were showed the ID cards and then asked if they had aphasia? Because a large portion of them still said they hadn't heard of it, even though they were in the
Well, so the question was, good question. So 5 minutes,
Oh.
but the question was about 5 minutes. But
yeah.
the question was like, before this study, underlined, have you ever heard of had you ever heard of aphasia? And so it was about asking about prior exposure. But one thing I liked about that finding, which was not something we were looking for at all, is that it kind of suggests that communication partner training and self-advocacy can really work together, because if someone's been trained on communicating with a person with aphasia, that's great. But of course, people forget things over time, but then that card can help retrieve what they previously learned. So cool. Yeah.
I'm curious, when was that data collected? Because, we saw this really
Yes.
big increase in awareness after Bruce Willis's diagnosis.
Yes,
And
it was just before the Willis effect. In our lab, we call it the Willis effect. Yeah. We have, one of my undergrads was actually investigating the Willis effect specifically. So yes, it was just prior to.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
That's good sign.
Yeah. And the numbers of the percentage of people who said they'd heard of aphasia is higher than in the 2020 National Aphasia Association's survey, but lower than the Willis effect, the 2022 one. So, yeah.
But I mean, we keep talking about this in our club. You can't wait for a Willis effect to increase this
No,
awareness. It's
yeah.
like, what do we have to do
Well,
to make that change?
And also, is the Willis effect still there? When NIA did that second survey, it was immediately after the Willis effect. And so I'm really interested to see, I don't know if they're going to run it in 20.
Well, so it's completely different.
Yeah.
Completely different observation, but Callie, our media person, went back and looked at which websites have got the biggest hit. And we went and found that we did an article about differential diagnosis between aphasia and dementia and what are the different types of dementia. And when Bruce Willis's condition got worse, there was again a spike in it. So I do think that media, public awareness increases, interest increases when there's something to look up, but that's not sustainable. That's not the way to go. Are there any other questions online?
Didn't see any yet.
Yeah, I mean, Jenny, this is such important work and it's so creative and it's
Actually really fun. Thank you. Yeah.
I'm sure it's gratifying
Yeah.
and it's just, we're all just waiting to see what you find and it's so hugely important. And you're doing it so systematically and carefully thought through. And of course, we have no questions because I think we're all in our heads thinking, oh my God, finally somebody's doing this, right? So, yeah, I feel like we're all like, oh my God, this is so important.
Well, thank you.
Other questions, points? No, I think you literally have us all floored.
I'm thinking of next iterations, oh, let's put some eyeglasses on them, the eye tracking,
I only have,
EEG.
What could you, I'm interested, do you have ideas for what to do with a possible repository of naturalistic sort of propositional language, what you're gonna create with collecting more diverse samples of people sort of?
To start, just more diverse sample on this particular set of stimuli on the service requests. But yes, it does lend itself to what would be another good genre to develop this type of database on. So
It's just so cool.
Actually, interesting, sorry, I don't mean to extend this, a thought of obviously maybe not feasible, but extending this to the service training, service industry training. I know that there's you have to do online modules and stuff for certain certifications. And if there was a way to then be oh, how do you interact with people with diverse communication needs and things like that? Just an introduction would be really cool as a functional thing.
And sort of tap tagging on to that, one of the things that I hear a lot, and I feel like this is something that National Aphasia Association should try to do, is really identify like a big repository or sort of a collection of situations where speaking is especially hard for people with aphasia. And, you know, the story that we've heard a lot, and we know, we all have individual stories, but, you know, people going to games and not being able to get in because they can't pull out the ticket in time or express that they have the ticket, but it's on their phone, like we, and I wonder if we actually did create that sort of a database of all sorts of situations where speaking is hard, and then you sort of use that as a naturalistic training thing, like these are the kinds of situations, how would you react with or without the training? Because this, it's so frustrating.
Yeah.
And as you said, it just, people just go away from it, and maybe we just don't know how many situations are difficult.
Yeah, that would be, really important to learn.
But I mean,
Yeah.
it's really meaningful that you found like even the introduction of the, you know, ID card or the self-advocacy, like how much it changes people's perceptions. So even just like a little bit of knowledge about aphasia and strategies would be amazing.
Great.
Yeah. I think we're slowly losing people. And if there's anybody who has questions, please feel free to email you,
Yeah,
Jenny.
I'm
and
happy,
Yeah.
more than happy to chat with anyone by email. Yeah, thank you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much for
Yeah,
coming. Yeah.
we'll let you go. Thank you, everyone. Join, if you want to say something.